Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of IANA's Intermodal Connects webinar series. It's great to have you all here. Today, I'm excited to have a friend of ours with us to talk about the introduction to intermodal rail. We're going to really break it down, kind of the nuts and bolts or the tracks and ties, if you will, of intermodal. And one of the key components of intermodal is the rail side. So with that, we've got Andy Adams here today. He is the Senior Solutions Engineer at Railinc and the Railinc's Training Institute instructor. With that, I am going to turn it over to Andy to kind of walk us through a very high level of intermodal and rail.
Great. Thank you, Hal. Good afternoon, everybody. As Hal said, I'm with Railinc. You're going to see Transmetric on your screen. Transmetric is the commercial division of Railinc. On the Railinc side, Railinc itself is a subsidiary of the AAR, the Association of American Railroads. The Railinc's main purpose in life is to do back-end data services and applications for the Class 1s, applications that you might have heard of, such as UMLR or EHMS or industry reference files. As part of that, we get about 10 million movement events, waybills, ETAs every day from across North America. And we're able to aggregate those into a single source of data. That's why you see the rail site supply chain visibility. That's where I spend most of my time. We do a lot of analytics and insights on that data for different customers. We serve shippers, we serve freight forwarders, we serve IMCs, we serve private car owners all across the rail ecosystem. In addition to those, on the carload side, we have a product called CarLogix, which is all about pool billing and managing car repair. And then on top of all of that, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we started the Railinc Training Institute. And we'll see more about the Railinc Training Institute later. But as part of that, we teach different folks who are new to rail across the ecosystem about the basics of railroading and intermodal. What you're going to see here today is part of our intermodal presentation that's typically much longer. But as Hal said, we're going to hit just a high level here. I could spend hours talking with you on any one of the slides here in the presentation. But because we've only got an hour, we're going to keep it at a very high level. And then I'll stay on for questions afterwards. So at the start, let's talk about what is intermodal and what we're talking about. If you pull out your logistics textbooks, intermodal in general is defined as the movement of finished goods or raw materials involving more than one mode of transportation. So typically what we think about is ocean to rail to motor carrier, or motor carrier to rail to ocean carrier via shipping containers, right? So that's the heart of everything we do here are those shipping containers. And we'll talk about those shipping containers and how the rails move them in a little bit more detail today. But we're going to focus today on just the rail aspect of it. So you're not going to hear me talk in terms of TEUs or voyage schedules or blank sailings or anything like that in the supply chain. We're just going to focus on the rail piece here this afternoon. So here's what I tell people internally at Railinc and when I teach intermodal. Why do we teach intermodal and how is it different? By far, it's the fastest growing rail segment. I have some stats from 2019 that'll show you those numbers. Carload has declined, coal has declined, not disappeared, but declined from where it was. And it's put an increased amount of importance on intermodal for the rails to replace that traffic. Certainly, we've all seen, especially during the pandemic, the e-commerce growth and explosion. I've read articles that said the pandemic accelerated e-commerce by a factor of 6 or 7 from its normal growth cycle. Intermodal tends to operate in more specific lanes on a scheduled basis than other rail traffic does. Intermodal groups at the railroads are often thought of as specific business units or separate business units. And then additionally, many of the intermodal customers like a UPS or FedEx, often operate on JB Hunt on contractual agreements with performance incentives. So that makes those all make it a little different than you would see in a carload movement. So let's talk about at the basis, who are the Class 1 railroads? Who are the railroads moving intermodal traffic? And so you can see the map there on the right with the legend. There are 7 currently Class 1 railroads. That could change in the next year or two if you follow the news around Canadian Pacific and KCS. But there are 7 Class 1 railroads. Starting in the west, you can see in the blue lines, that would be Union Pacific. In the orange lines, that would be BNSF. If you move up into Canada, the red line is Canadian National. The darker gray there is Canadian Pacific. If you move to the east, the yellow lines there are CSX. The darker lines are Norfolk Southern. And then you also see KCS is kind of in the black there. If you look around Dallas and down into Mexico, that's Kansas City Southern and Kansas City Southern of Mexico that operate. Those are the 7 big Class 1s. The map you see does not represent every rail line that's out there for a Class 1. The map you see is just the North American Intermodal Network. There are regional railroads. The size of a railroad depends on the revenues. So a Class 1 railroad would be basically $490 million a year or more by the last AAR fact book. There are regionals that are a little smaller like that. The biggest ones that participate in intermodal would be FEC, which is the Florida East Coast, which you can see on the right on the east coast of Florida, the green line. FXE in Mexico, the National Railroad of Mexico, that would be the red lines in Mexico. Iowa Interstate participates as a bridge line. Indiana Railroad participates as a bridge line. Those are all regional railroads. Very few, if any, of the true short lines actually play in intermodal, though that is growing and that is changing a little bit as you see the idea of ramps pop up or smaller railroads or smaller towns trying to participate in intermodal rail. You'll notice that in the US, there is no contiguous rail from West Coast to East Coast, that dividing line is the Mississippi River. There have always been dreams of that contiguous east-west system, but honestly, I don't see that happening in any time in the near future. You will see a continuous north-south railroad should the merger between Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern be approved by the STB. Then it's not called NAFTA anymore, it's called USMCA. In that regard, you'll see a true Canada, US, Mexico contiguous supply chain railroad. So let's cover some common intermodal terms. If you've never talked in the industry before, the industry is full of acronyms and lingo. So excuse me today if I use terms, I'm going to use them all presentation long. The first term that you hear quite a bit is ISO containers. ISO stands for the International Standards Organization, which way back in the 50s and 60s set agreed on sizes for containers moving on container ships. There you see a ship that's actually in Savannah. And those are the ISO containers are the 20-foot, 40-foot, 45-foot, and 48-foot long containers that are carried on container ships all over the world. There are millions and millions and millions of these containers, and they're referred to as ISO or international containers. The other major type of container is a domestic container, which is 53 foot long. Some of them are now 60 feet long. We'll talk about that in a little bit later on. But these 53-foot containers, which were built to match the size of a truck trailer, of a standard truck trailer, move only within North America. So those shipments, you see JB Hunt kind of dominates that market. They're about a third ownership in that domestic container market. But those are the containers that move only within North America. And when you listen to a presentation, like if you were listening to Larry Gross and he talks in ISO or domestic, that's what he's referring to. Another common term that you hear is BCO. BCO is the beneficial cargo owner, or shortened to the beneficial owner. I've heard it referred to as the Benny owner in some lingo, but they are the ultimate owner of the shipment in the container. Unlike carload shipments, where you'll see very specific shipper consignee, those would be the main waybill parties. The beneficial cargo owner fills that role for intermodal. They can either book a shipment directly themselves through the railroads, or they can rely on a third party, like a freight forwarder or an IMC. On a railway bill, when you look at a railway bill, they may or may not be on the railway bill. A lot of that depends on who the customer is of the railroad. So if I'm looking at an international container and the rail move is contracted from, let's just say, Maersk to BNSF, Maersk would show up as the shipper and the consignee, and the BCO may be there or may not be there in the documentation, even if it's on the bill of lading. But in domestic shipments, the beneficial cargo owner is typically there. And when I talk about a BCO, these would be the companies like the Walmarts, the Home Depots, the Dollar Generals, the Amazons. They would be beneficial cargo owners and owners of the property in the container. Interestingly, Amazon and Walmart in the last couple of years have invested in their own container fleet and sort of cut out the middle company in that regard. NVOCC stands for non-vessel owning common carrier. So what an NVOCC does is they go out and book a block of space on an ocean carrier. So they'll book, say, 1,000 TEUs worth of space, containers worth of space on the ocean carrier. The ocean carrier sells that to them at a discount because it's a guaranteed sale on the ship for the sailing. And then the NVOCC can turn around and market that space to different BCOs or different shippers in the supply chain. And they make their money in the chain based on the difference between what they charge the BCO for handling the booking for them, for handling the shipments, and the discount that they paid to get the space in the first place. So a good example of that would be an Expeditors or a DSV that plays in that space. So you can't talk intermodal, certainly not these days, without talking about drayage or dray carriers. When you hear dray, that's just the common name for moving a container from the customer dock to the rail ramp, or conversely from the rail ramp to the customer dock. You'll also hear this called first mile and last mile when you're listening to logistics or reading about logistics. And that's what that means. That first mile, last mile is getting the container from the customer to the rail ramp and vice versa. So let's talk about the different types of equipment that are out there. The first thing we'll talk about are intermodal well cars or intermodal spine cars. The picture on the upper left on your screen is an intermodal well car. Those cars can either come as a single well, a 3-well, or a 5-well in a single car. So the picture you see on the upper left there, a well is just simply the space that carries the container. The car you see in the upper left there would be referred to as a 3-pack. For an intermodal well car, if it had 5, you would hear it referred to as a 5-pack. And those can carry a single container. They're most often double stacked. There are lots of instances where they could carry 3 containers in a single well. So when you talk about the car you see on the screen there, theoretically, it could carry anywhere from 3 to 9 containers. And I'll explain some of that later on the loadings of containers on the cars. Or they could carry a trailer. They're set up that you could drop a trailer in there and a truck trailer could move in there. The car you see on the upper right is referred to as a spine car because it is literally just that. It is a spine down the middle with a platform on either side to set the wheels on. The kind of orange piece you see there on the top of the car towards the front is a hitch post where they could raise that. The front of the trailer sits on the hitch post. The back of the trailer with the wheels sits on the side slats, and it's a spine car. Spine cars come in arrangements of either 3 or 5. So the one you see on the screen there would be a 3-pack spine car. And when we talk about cars that are 3-packs or 5-packs, those cars are typically articulated. What do we mean by articulated? In the bottom left there, you can see a picture of an actual intermodal flat car, well car, that's articulated. So you can see each end of the car sits on a single rail truck. The biggest reasons these are done is that these cars, the containers are typically lighter in weight than a typical rail commodity would be, like a grain or cement on a car. And also it cuts down the number of wheels needed to move the car if the car shares wheels. The biggest expense by far in owning a rail car or leasing a rail car after you've paid for it from the manufacturer is maintaining wheel health and replacing the wheels. So anytime you can cut down on the number of wheels in a car, that cuts down on the amount of maintenance that you have to do on the car, and it's typically able to carry those loads just fine in the articulation. So who owns the cars? By far, you can't talk about intermodal car management without talking about TTX. TTX owns somewhere on the order of 80% of the intermodal well cars and spine cars. TTX calls themselves the railcar pooling experts. There are a bunch of smart people at TTX that maintain these cars in pools and assign those pools out to the different railroads. They do a lot of economic analysis for seeing what's coming up and the supply chain and trying to distribute those cars out amongst the different railroads. TTX is owned by the Class 1s, just like Railinc is, plus Pan Am and FXE. They kind of work with the railroads to distribute those cars. They also manage other flats, just regular flats that you'll see a lot of military equipment or farm equipment move on it. And they also own a whole bunch of boxcars and play sort of in the North American boxcar pool and managing their boxcars and pools for moving equipment. So let's talk about the different kinds of containers and trailers that are out there. I've got an appendix at the end that sort of covers these in more detail. The dry van ISO containers, which means they're basically just a box, usually with a wooden floor made of either aluminum or steel. The two most common sizes are 20-foot and 40-foot. There are also still some 45-foot and 48-foot containers out there, but they are much smaller in numbers. Typically, you would see the dry van ISO container is the most common type of container out there in the industry today. You can also have an ISO reefer container. All that means is that there's a refrigeration unit on the end of the container. You can see those are typically 40 feet in length. They usually run with some gasoline in them. There's a battery in them as well, but that's for cold shipments, like transporting food or anything else that needs to be done with refrigeration. There are 20-foot tank containers used for carrying liquids, which are basically just an outside shell of a container with a tank in the middle of it for liquids. For domestic containers, we talked earlier, the vast majority, 99% of them are 53 feet long. There are also 53-foot refrigerated containers, and those are the domestic containers that move just in North America. A few years ago, Canadian Tire worked with Canadian National and created a 60-foot domestic container specifically for moving tires across Canada. You'll also see the railroads will carry trailers. It used to be when intermodal started, trailers were the intermodal product. Moving for the railroads, those are all 53 feet long, and they either come in a dry van or a refrigerated model. And then back at the beginning of the pandemic, we really saw an explosion of the 28-foot truck trailers. Those are called pup trailers. And the reason they were using 28-foot pup trailers was easier access in the major cities. So you'll see it on a slide later, but the Amazonization of the economy drove that need for 24-hour delivery. It was much easier to move those 28-foot containers inside major cities than it is to move the 53-foot containers inside major cities. And lingo-wise, when you're in the intermodal industry, you may also hear containers referred to as boxes or cans in the lingo. So when you hear that, that just generally means they're talking about a container of some sort. Can't talk intermodal without talking the chassis. Chassis are a big topic in the intermodal industry. That is basically a rubber tired trailer underframe that sits underneath the container. So when the container is going to be moved from a customer dock to the rail ramp, or the rail ramp to a customer dock, or a port out to a customer dock, or a distribution center, it's going to sit on a chassis. Chassis all used to be owned in an ISO sense, international sense, by the ocean carriers. They got out of that game some years ago. And so now when you talk chassis, there's an endless discussion about who should own them, who should pay for them, who should pay to repair them. That's a big topic in the industry. You'll see a lot of chassis pools now. Like I just saw the announcement of the creation of another large chassis pool in the Southeast to serve some of the Southeastern ports. And then motor carriers also have to pay a per diem charge in using the chassis, which prevents, in reality, the chassis going out and never coming back, or ending up like a container in somebody's yard, just sitting out there. So chassis are extremely important to the industry in moving the containers. So let's talk a little bit about the railroads and how they view intermodal. All 7 Class 1s play a role in both domestic and intermodal shipments. We talked about some regionals and a very few short lines playing the game. Railroads work with third parties or truckers to handle the drayage. Sometimes the railroads handle their own drayage. We don't have a slide on it today, but there are things called door-to-door services where the railroad will take the call from a customer that needs to move a container, and the railroads will arrange the dray. The railroads will arrange the movement on it. So they both compete with the trucks and cooperate with the trucks in that sense. Intermodal now makes up more than half of all Class 1 shipment volume. I've used 2019, the last sort of normal year that we have a record for pre-pandemic. And you can see that it turned the corner in 2019, where there were more total shipments of intermodal than there were carload out there. And some of us at Railinc like to watch. There's a service that puts cameras up at railroad hotspots, like virtual railfan cameras. And if anybody doubts that intermodal is king, just watch a camera or go set trackside and watch the railroad someday and see more than half of the trains by far move by our intermodal trains. So here's how intermodal shipments move. So let's talk about ISO, or if you were to listen to a Larry Gross presentation, he calls that IPI, or Inland Point Intermodal. You can read this little diagram above. As an import shipment would move left to right. So an import shipment is a shipment coming in from Asia or Europe or overseas to North America. It would be handled by the ocean carrier. They would dock at the port facility. Any containers that are moving by rail would be mounted onto the rail car, either at the port or just off dock from the port. They would then move between different intermodal ramps, the train, until it gets to its final inland ramp. And then the container would be handed over to a motor carrier to take it to a customer dock or a distribution center, a customer distribution center. For an export container that's moving from North America, somewhere inland in North America, to overseas, it would be just the reverse. You could read that from right to left. The motor carrier brings the container into the intermodal ramp. The container is then mounted on a rail car. That's called a ramp event. It then leaves, and the train will stop at sometimes at intermodal ramps, intermediate intermodal ramps. Finally, it would get to the port or the facility just off the port, unloaded from the train, and loaded either directly onto the boat or trucked between the facility and the boat. It would be loaded on the boat and off it goes. Loading the containers on the train is referred to as a ramp. Taking them off the train is referred to as a deramp in the railroad lingo. When you look at events and look at intermodal events, that's what those represent. For a domestic move, it's a little simpler that you don't have the ocean carrier involved. And so all of those moves tend to be a motor carrier brings the container into the railroad facility. The container gets ramped on the rail car. The train leaves, moves between different intermodal ramps, arrives at that final destination ramp. It gets deramped off the train. The customer is notified. The motor carrier picks it up and takes it to the customer dock or the customer distribution center. Trailers, of course, do not need a chassis. Those are all domestic moves, and those can be loaded directly onto the rail cars. They don't have to be tied to a chassis or untied from a chassis first before they can move on the rail. So let's talk about the different kinds of intermodal train makeups. The first one you'll see is all domestic containers and trailers. These are normally the hottest trains on the railroad. Lots of them have performance guarantees and penalties tied to them. When you talk in terms of especially the Western carriers, BNSF and UP, they will refer to those as Z trains or priority intermodal trains. They cost a little bit more to use for the customer to ship on, but they generally get more priority on the road, and they generally get performance guarantees. The next kind of train you can see is all ISO containers, all international containers out there that run at different priorities. Typically, they run at a lesser priority than the domestic intermodal trains. Now, in the era of longer trains, I'm watching a lot more domestic and intermodal trains run together. I think you've probably all heard, if you follow the rail side, of now there are 12,000, 15,000, 16,000 foot trains. It's not uncommon to see, especially out west, an entire makeup of domestic containers, like a full train, some locomotives in the middle of the train, and then an entire train of international containers behind it moving. But those are generally combinations they run in. You can also hear the term bear tables out there. All a bear table means is that they're all empty intermodal containers or intermodal cars being repositioned, right? So much of the traffic, the majority of the traffic moves from the west, we'll just say the West Coast inland to Chicago without equivalent reverse moves to fill up that equipment. So occasionally in Chicago or in Dallas or somewhere from inland, they'll load up a train with all empty intermodal flats and spine cars, maybe load it up with some empty containers and ship that back to where the containers are needed or the trailers are needed to move inland. And now, in the era of precision scheduled railroading, which could be a whole 1 hour class on its own, you start to see some intermodal move with carload or carload combined with intermodal. People make a big deal out of that now in railroading, that those are moving together. But as Yogi Berra said, that's really deja vu all over again, because intermodal and carload started mixed together back in the 60s and 70s. You'll often hear the term double stack containers when talking about intermodal movements. All that simply refers to are two containers stacked one on top of the other. In a well car, or one container stacked on top of two containers in a single well car. This is what makes intermodal profitable for the railroads. As you all know, margins can be kind of tight in intermodal, and double stacking the containers inside a single well means the railroads get to move two moves for the price of one. The well cars made that possible. When you hear intermodal talked about at the railroads, or you hear container moves, you'll often hear it referred to as a stack train or just stacks. out there. So if a railroad talks about moving stacks, they're really just talking about moving a double stack intermodal train. We've mentioned 1 to 3 containers can be loaded in a single well. That number depends on the weight and the commodity and the weight limit of the car. And occasionally you'll still hear this referred to as COFC or container on flat car. Almost nobody refers to it as COFC anymore. They'll just say stacks or double stacks or an intermodal train. The railroads still do move trailers in intermodal trains, a fair amount of trailers, though they prefer that business to come in a container because a container is easier to stack and double stack. Truck trailers were originally said to be riding piggyback on a rail car. So in the old days, you would hear it called a piggyback train. Old time railroaders will still refer to intermodal trains as pigs or a pig train. Which is just shortened lingo for a piggyback train. Trailers are typically loaded on a spine car for movement, though they can go on a regular flat car or they could go in a well car. And the percentage of trailers that move on rail since the mid 80s have dropped from about 80% to 20% as the railroads have tried to steer that business more into containers. Why do trucking companies like to move on rail at all? They get distance economics out of it. I think J.B. Hunt was the first company to actually figure this out, that if you just had your drivers move within a certain range of a rail ramp and got them home every night, you could retain them better than sending them 2,000 miles across the country and back. So they get distance economics. It's cheaper and faster to move a mass amount of trailers, maybe not a single trailer, but a mass amount of trailers by rail. They get the flexibility of having either a driver take it or handing it to the railroads. And e-commerce kind of accelerated trailers for a little bit, though that has faded away a little bit since the beginning of the pandemic. When railroads talk about moving intermodal shipments, they talk about it in terms of lanes. You can't just say, pick up my container in the middle of Iowa and take it to the middle of Maine. Railroads move in terms of lanes where they have ramps, right? So when we talk in intermodal terms in rail, we talk about origin ramps and destination ramps and the lanes between them. Some larger metropolitan areas have more than one ramp available and multiple lanes. I think there are 20, at least in the Chicago area alone, between the different railroads in intermodal ramps. And when you go to schedule a shipment of a container, you need to be aware of the facility, the service times, the gate times, the train availability, and what the lane availability is when you hand your container over. So some common lanes would be like Chicago to Los Angeles. Global 2 would be a UP facility in Chicago. BNSF runs a lot between LA Long Beach and Chicago, or Seattle to Minneapolis, CSX, Jacksonville to Memphis. You get the idea on lanes for how the containers move. Typically intermodal containers, intermodal trains may not take just any route, any track between 2 points. And the reason for that is years ago, notches were cut in tunnels, tracks had to be lowered under overpasses, bridges had to be raised or whatever to allow double stack containers to fit underneath them. When an intermodal train moves, it has to move over a specific lane that's been designed to handle the height of a double stack container. We talk a lot in terms of ramps, especially at Railinc, when we talk about intermodal. A ramp is just slang for an intermodal terminal. It dates back to the days when trailers were loaded onto trains using circus ramps, or an incline was backed up to the train and the trailer was either backed onto the rail car or driven onto the rail car. And that was called a circus ramp. That ramp term just kind of hung with the industry. They are most often standalone facilities for the railroads, though you can see them on the side of freight yards or beside freight yards. A good example is CSX's Bedford Park facility is right next to BRC's clearing yard, the big carload yard. but most often they're standalone facilities and they're as close to major highways as possible for moving the containers. An intermodal facility or an intermodal ramp will typically have entrance and exit gates. If you deal with the trucks at all and motor carriers, you know you have to stop at an entrance, scan in, provide a number to get in, like a pickup number to get in. You have to check in before you leave. So there are entrance and exit gates. There's arrival and departure yards for trains, for building trains, dropping off trains, storing flat cars. You'll see lift devices. We'll talk about the two most common in just a second here. You'll see storage tracks for empty cars. You'll see storage lot for containers, trailers, chassis, and you'll see maintenance areas. A maintenance area, when it deals with a chassis, is typically referred to as a roadability lot or a roadability part of the intermodal facility. Another common term that you'll hear used quite a bit is transloading. Now, when we're talking about intermodal, and what transloading is, an international container, a company will ship in some ISO containers. So they'll come into, say, Los Angeles in 40-foot containers, 20-foot containers. Those containers will be taken to a distribution facility that's near the port. Those containers will be emptied and repacked into 53-foot containers, domestic containers, and then handed over to the railroads. So the reason customers would do this, like a BCO would do this, is that you can repack 3 40-foot containers into 2 53-foot containers, say, right? And then you can send those containers out to specific stores or distribution centers, but you would take them to your distribution center, repack them into domestic containers, then hand them to the railroads to go across country. So what that gains you is only paying for 2 containers instead of 3. It also offers you the priority or speed advantage of using domestic intermodal. It sometimes gains you the same service guarantees that are a part of that train. That's what transloading means when it's talked about in an intermodal sense. There's also transloading in a carload sense, which is basically moving commodities between a rail car and a truck, or a truck and a rail car. But in intermodal terms, it means unpacking from international containers and repacking into domestic containers. We talked about lifting the containers, ramping the containers onto the train. There are 2 basic types of cranes inside of intermodal facilities, which are gantry cranes, which you can see there operate on wheels. There's a lane within the facility. The gantry crane spans over the tracks, lifts the container off the chassis. You can, in the upper picture there, you can see the chassis sitting beside the rail, and the gantry crane will lift the container off the chassis, put it on the rail car, or vice versa, if it needs to come off the train and go onto a chassis. And then the second most kind is a side lift crane, which can lift the container off the chassis and onto the train, or reach over and lift it off the train and put it down onto a chassis, or put it on the ground for storage. So I get the question a lot internally: if you're double stacking containers, how do they stay together? How do they stay connected to one another? The answer to that is interbox connectors, or just IBCs. As they're talked about, they sit between the container, and then the handle or lock is pulled to the other side, and it locks the containers together. You can see circled in red here on the right is that connection point. Now, these happen to be 53-foot containers, but you see the connection point is set back a little bit on the container. That's so that a 53-foot container could ride on top of a 40-foot container. That line would line up with the end of a 40-foot container or the edge of two 20-foot containers. And the connector would go here on the structural point between the containers. So here's a little fancy artwork that I made here for internal presentation. It gives you some idea of the loading configuration on a train. Lots of companies use Railinc's UMLR system to get information on the flat cars, on the well cars. like how much weight they can hold, what they're designed to hold, how many wells are in a car, and then they build out load planning, or they use someone else's an external company's load planning system, and they determine based on the weight of the container and the weight limit on the car how they can stack those containers together. So when you're talking about 53-foot well cars, you can obviously stack two 53-foot containers together. If you've got weight limitations, you would just put a single container there. You could put a 60-foot on top of a 53-foot, a 53-foot on top of a 40-foot, a 53-foot on top of two 20s on the car. And a question I regularly get is, how come the bigger container goes on top of the smaller container and not the other way around? The answer is aerodynamics. In this case, if you have the 40-foot on top of the 53-foot, it would create more distance between the container in front and the container in back. Or if you had two 20s on top of a 53, it would create a lot of space between the top containers, which would create more wind resistance. And it doesn't take a whole lot of wind resistance to start costing you extra fuel on the locomotives to move the train. The 40-foot well cars are pretty straightforward, where you have 40s, one on top of the other, two 20s together, a 40 on top of two 20s, a single 40. And then the spine cars, you can see here, they're 53, 56-foot long spine cars where you can handle a single trailer. There are some where you can handle a pair of 28-foot trailers, or you're able to put a single container on top of a spine car to move. So I've also included an appendix, which gives you a little more detailed information on some of the container sizes with the height, the length, the width, the cargo capacity on those containers. Talks about the trailers a little bit more, breaks down a little bit more information on the flat cars, and gives you a little more information on an articulated car. So that's all of the presentation slides I had. I'll talk to you for just a second here about the Training Institute. What you saw here was about a third of the intermodal rail operations class, where we go into a lot more detail on intermodal in general. In the events you would see in a movement cycle, all of the detailed events from the railroads that you would see reported in the movement cycle. If for customers who are really brand new to railroading, we do a railroading basics or a railroading operations course that covers everything from who the railroads are to what all of the basic types of equipment are and how they think about the world. We have a loaded rail car shipment cycle that talks through all of the event reporting and details behind a carload shipment. And then we also do customized training for customers who come in and just want some kind of tailored instruction on railroad knowledge and how the railroads operate. So that's all I had for right now. Hal, I'll hand it back to you guys for questions.
Excellent. Andy, thank you so much. That was great. And we do have a bunch of questions. We're going to go ahead and jump right in. The first one, it's a good one, around drayage. Does drayage not also include transport of a container from a port terminal to a distribution center or some other type of warehouse structure by truck?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But we just focused on movement between the rail ramp today. But drayage does include any movement of the container between any 2 points.
Here's one about, and you mentioned it before in terms of, there's no single railroad that runs all the way from the West Coast to the East Coast or vice versa. So this is a question around goods transfer or shipment transfer. Is it still the responsibility of the origin railroad to deliver the intermodal load to the connecting carrier in both steel wheel and rubber tire crosstown interchanges?
Yes, right. And there's two different types of shipments in that regard from the origin railroad that a customer can use. If you're not using a door-to-door service and you just whoever talks to the railroad directly, you can do that as a prepaid move between the two railroads, where you just pay for one, the origin railroad to move the container, and then they arrange the arrangements with the second railroad, and then you only pay your origin railroad, and then they pay the second railroad in the route. Or you can do what's called a Rule 11 shipment in the industry, where you can negotiate the move from, we'll just use Raleigh because I'm outside of Raleigh, from Raleigh to Chicago, and then you can negotiate with BNSF or UP to move the container from Chicago to Salt Lake City, right? And then you negotiate both sides of that move. You pay both of those railroads for the move.
Thank you, Andy. So here is a question around IBCs. Are IBCs always serviced by a human, a person, the locking, unlocking process?
Today, Hal, yes, but I know several of the railroads are trying to play with robotics, right? About putting those IBCs in without, because today it always takes whoever employs the people in the yard. It takes a human being to climb up the rail car and climb up on there and put the IBC in place and lock the IBC. But there are railroads playing with the idea, have long dreamed of the idea of having that done automatically.
Yeah, and I'll just carry on that. IANA's operations committee has looked at automated IBCs previously, and it's still sort of an open topic. But the notion of trying to eliminate the ascends and descends for the groundsmen, the grounds workers at terminals to physically climb up, place it, and then have to climb back up and take it off after. They're I think I want to say they're about 15 pounds each. So they're the standard IBC is not a light piece of equipment for sure.
And they're surprisingly strong, Hal, in their connection. I've seen videos and pictures of trains that have been hit by 55, 65 mile an hour winds or a tornado, and they may come off the rail car, but they don't come apart.
Yeah. They're the sheer factors on those are pretty
right.
Amazing. I think a lot of folks take them for granted, and that they're obviously extremely important. Here's a question around high cubes, which is a type of box of container. Do you run into stacking issues with high cubes?
Yes, you can run into stacking issues, and that's why load planning and knowing the well car, the characteristics of the well car, is so important for being able to stack the containers correctly. Because like I said, there are defined intermodal routes out there where they've notched tunnels or lowered rights of way under bridges. And so that's why load planning is so important for the railroads when loading the cars.
I live in
and that's
Baltimore.
Sometimes how when you
Go ahead.
see a container running solo, right? Well, you see one container in a well, it's because they would have had height issues and stacking issues if they double stacked it.
It can be really challenging, particularly when you're dealing with older infrastructure. I live in Baltimore, and we have a series of tunnels that are operated, and they restrict the ability to run double stack because they're about 16 inches too short. So there's a significant undertaking going on to sort that out to help optimize that. But I think you touched on it, and it really kind of shows a light into the kinds of opportunity there are in railroading and in intermodal. Is load planning is talk about an art and a science. Just so many factors going there. And I know, just to riff on that, you've done a whole lot with analytics and really digging into optimization and better understanding, how to learn from the actions of the industry. And I just want to call that out, because I think it's a fascinating piece that folks wouldn't necessarily automatic, when they think railroads, they think of someone probably sitting in the seat that you're sitting in right there in that locomotive cab, operating a train. And those are obviously hugely important individuals, but those are individuals in a cast of thousands to move this equipment around and these goods around. A sidebar on just some of the opportunities in intermodal that I think people need to know about. Here's one. Who tends to own / operate the rail tracks upon which containers move between ocean ports and inland transportation facilities?
Yeah, that's a good question, Al. I should have mentioned that when we talked about the railroads. So the Class 1 railroads own their own tracks, right? Which is far different from the rest of the world, where the government sort of owns the infrastructure and the railroads operate more like motor carriers. In North America, the railroads, by and large, own the track that the containers move on. There are instances where the state has gotten involved and saved a line from being abandoned and saved service on the line and own the tracks. But by and large, the railroads own their own tracks. They pay for their own maintenance. They pay for their own infrastructure on those tracks. They get very little federal or governmental help to maintain that infrastructure. So in North America, the railroads very much own that right of way and that track.
Yeah, that's an important thing to underscore, particularly when we're talking about the infrastructure bill that was passed and how that gets played out is the important things to keep in mind about the fact that the railroads own and have owned and spend billions of dollars each year to maintain that, all to make sure that they're holding up their end. So that's a great question and a great answer. Here's a question around telemetry. How is telemetry handled? Is real-time tracking available to BCOs or others?
It depends what you said. This is going to be a longer answer, because this is kind of where we live, right, as Railinc. So yes, there's telemetry out there. So lots of the domestic containers have GPS on them and telemetry, right? Most of the ISO boxes do not yet have telemetry on them and rely on other methods for reporting. So once a container is loaded on a rail car, there is GPS, but there's also an association made between the container and the rail car. As the rail car passes by AEI scanners, automated equipment identification scanners, the railroads report events, those near real-time events, as the rail car passes a scanner, and those get uploaded. So we talk a lot about GPS in the industry, right? Everybody wants that Domino's pizza-like solution where I can see my pizza from the time it leaves the Domino's till the time it gets to my dock. Well, it's sort of applicable and comparable, but it's not, right? Because if you're talking about your pizza, it's only coming from 2 to 5 miles away, right? And if your pizza's stopped, it's either the driver stopped to deliver another pizza or they're at a red light somewhere, right? In traffic. But on rails, a GPS is by and large, I mean, you can do like you'll hear like Ted from Tiger Cool Express talk about using GPS and telemetry and maintaining the correct temperatures inside their containers because they move a lot of food and cold goods. But by itself, GPS is only a point in space as the container moves. So unless you add to it some kind of intelligence around like a geofence for where it is in a yard, or you add some kind of other data like AEI data to it, then that paints a complete picture. So yes, there is telemetry out there. And just my opinion, telemetry doesn't solve the whole thing for you, because when it's moving, it's great. But when it's stopped, you need that information as to why in that 1,000-mile, 1,500-mile, 2,000-mile journey, why it stopped, where it is, and where it is.
That's a great point of clarification. Here's a question around what happens once the train arrives at a ramp. The loads are deramped. What happens? Are they placed on the ground? Are they placed on chassis? Could you talk a little bit about how that process works?
Sure. So when a train arrives, the event you'll see is typically it's arrived at that final destination. It's arrived at its ramp, right? That does not mean that the container immediately comes off the train. It just means it's arrived at that ramp, right? And then the ground crews, when they get to that train, will unload it, put it on a chassis, and either it's ready to go, like it's ready to go right then, or it gets stacked on the ground. It gets pulled off and restacked on the ground in a pile. A couple of things happen at that point. One, it gets a lot number and a pickup number assigned to the container that goes on there. There's an event that gets generated for taking the container off the train. There's an event that gets generated for tying the container onto a chassis, and then they'll notify you that the container is ready to be picked up. Right? We didn't talk at all in terms of detention or last free day in the presentation here, but once they notify you that that container is ready to go, depending on the rail ramp, the time of day, whether it's a holiday, the day of week, you have a specified number of hours to come get your box. Because when we talked about the ramps in the railroad facilities, there is a limited amount of real estate available to them to store those containers for long periods of time. And so they'll notify you to come get them, or they'll start charging you rent on their space, basically.
There's a lot of discussions around the difference between a grounded container and a wheeled container facility. And I think in general, marine facilities tend to be grounded, and in general, rail facilities tend to be wheeled, which is the box on chassis, but that is not by any means a universal statement.
Right.
And the chassis ownership is a whole other session that we'll have to do another time, because we as much as I would love to be here for longer, I think we'll be able to take one or two more questions and then wrap up. And here's one that I think strikes to the heart of a lot of interesting positive aspects about intermodal. But here's the question: have you all noticed a shift in priorities or focus in the processes and the tools that have helped intermodal terminals and rail lines operate in a more sustainable manner?
Yes, I mean, technology is always right at the forefront. IANA has a lot of committees that are talking about technologies and how better to employ technologies in scheduling or moving the boxes. I mean, certainly we're talking about autonomous vehicles or electric vehicles inside the terminals, both for efficiency and for environmental reasons. Inside the terminals, we see a lot of people just on the IT side trying to get better at tracking and planning and estimating. We talk a lot here at Railinc, and I hear other people talk about artificial intelligence, right? And the employment of artificial intelligence into the system, trying to not just tell you what's going on, but what's about to go on with your container and the things you need to take action on. So yes, all of that. Technology is a constant discussion inside the industry.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on there and do a little cheerleading myself. Rail in particular is incredibly environmentally friendly when compared to anything other than pulling it yourself. The notion of the average intermodal train takes about 300 trucks off the highways, and when you factor that into one or two, three, a handful at the most locomotives pulling a intermodal train carry more than 300 containers, you're really starting to talk about significant impact. Not to mention that the locomotive technology has been constantly been improving for efficiency over time, and the rails spend a good amount of time on that, as well as the lift equipment, the equipment that is used to move the containers on and off ramp and D-ramp in both environments, in the rail and in the marine environment. You hit the nail on the head. The sort of not obvious but core environmental activity that the industry can do is become more efficient and waste less time. Someone once told me that the most efficient and the most environmental friendly truck is one that is moving, not idling. So the efficiency of terminals and ramps and ports is a big component of keeping those going, while things like alternative fuel power units come online and allow us
Yep.
to move, do that drain
Battery
move.
powered locos.
Exactly.
Yep.
So that, you know, there's a huge amount of activity going on in the industry right now to be more efficient and be more environmentally friendly and lower that carbon footprint. So I think it's a great question, a great question to kind of wrap up on. And I know that we've unfortunately had to leave a number of questions on the table. I'd love to get you back at some point, Andy, and maybe we can do a round two, a 102. This was sort of a 101. We can do a 102. But
Sure.
thanks for everybody for their time and coming in and spending it with us. Thank you again, Andy, for making the time, doing the hard work and breaking this all down for us. And I would encourage anybody that has got other questions to let us know. Just reach out to us at intermodal.org. You can send me emails at info@intermodal.org or hal@intermodal.org, and we will get those answered as best we can. If you've got other information needs, head on over to intermodal.org. There's a lot of information and pertinent to this particular discussion. If you go to the education tab and click on the first option, there's a glossary and a fact book that will lay in some of the basics. But Andy did a great job of really kind of bringing that all to life. Thanks again for joining us at IANA, the connecting force behind intermodal freight.